Ukrainian army, without all doubt, is the most competent armed force in the world at this point. They are just brilliant at what they do. They do take casualties because it's a meat grinder of a war, but they could have gone on to Kursk. This was a very strategic operation, which had the goals of putting President Zelensky in a place where he could, should Russia weaken at any time, continue on further or crack their line in the south, should they, or threaten their logistics to the east. It gave him a multitude of directions he could create a threat to Vladimir Putin. I just don't believe Putin thinks it's real. I think he believes this is just some demonstration attack. It's not as severe as it could be.
Hello and welcome to Frontline, Times Radio's interview series about the war in Ukraine and global security. I'm James Hansen, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Malcolm Nance, an intelligence and foreign policy analyst and a former senior chief petty officer in the US Navy. He's a 5-time New York Times bestselling author, and in 2022 he joined the Ukrainian Foreign Legion. Malcolm, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
It's my pleasure to be here.
I wanted to start by getting your assessments of what the Ukrainians are doing at the moment to take the fight to Russia, because there's been a lot of coverage, understandably, about the incremental advances that Russia continue to make in the east of Ukraine. But I think it's interesting that we have had, in the past month or so, a renewed offensive in Kursk by Ukraine. And we're also seeing what appears to be a ramped up assassination campaign in Russian territory by Ukraine, spearheaded by Budanov. What do you make of what Ukraine are doing at the moment to take the fight to Russia?
Well, first off, I think there are a lot of how can I put it, myths that are in the popular news about what actually is happening in the war on Ukraine. I mean, if you come to some parts of the United States, they're being told that Ukraine is losing badly and that Russia is making all of these major advances, and that couldn't be any further from the truth. Russia's advances over the last year can be measured in tens of kilometers, just not much, while losing hundreds of thousands of soldiers, as many as 100,000 soldiers just in the last year, to take a few kilometers down in Donetsk province, as well as trying to maintain a defense up in Kursk governorate inside of Russia itself. Ukraine, on the other hand, last year carried out a blitz offensive onto Russia itself and took hundreds of kilometers of territory. Right now, I believe it's over 500 square kilometers of territory, and created this salient, this giant pocket inside of Russia itself, which removed a lot of forces that could have been used for reinforcements in Donetsk, Luhansk, and the northern sectors, and has taken the fight onto Russia's terrain. By doing that, Russia had to, they don't see it, but we see it as debasing themselves to actually have to go to North Korea and beg for soldiers to come onto the battle line. North Korea sent those soldiers, mainly North Korean special forces, who they themselves have been savaged by the Ukrainians. Look, I have friends who are still on the line up there in Kursk, and they are savaging the North Koreans so badly that they had to be pulled off of the actual front lines over the last month. Ukraine just recently started carrying out a series of tactical offensives in order to not only stabilize the line, but to destabilize Russia's ability to supply itself and maintain any sort of momentum inside Kursk itself. So when you look at it this way, some people say, well, this is a big folly going into Kursk. All it proves is Ukraine can go in there. They can't sustain it. They're doing it just for political purposes and losing troops to get into a better negotiating position. I don't believe that at all. As a matter of fact, if Russia's line were to crack anywhere to the north of Kharkiv, in Russia, in Kursk, it could threaten Volgograd. And which is Russia's main supply base for the entirety of the eastern battlefront. So who knows if or when that could happen. But Ukraine has been very adept at exploiting Russia's weaknesses, and Russia is just barely holding on by its teeth.
So you think, Malcolm, it is not unrealistic that Ukraine could actually capture even more Russian territory?
Well, I mean, it's a question of you have to understand how this war is being fought. Ukraine's commanders are brilliant. They are the most adaptive people we've seen. They will be training in NATO war colleges for decades in how to fight a major peer-to-peer adversary. However, you have to understand that war is not, blitzkrieg the way it was in World War II. This is a grinding war. There's actually, much less trench than you can imagine. Trench lines are actually segregated by large, series of defensive positions between villages. And it's not blitz warfare. It is maneuver warfare within Kursk province, where the Ukrainians can take forces and come around. Russia does these bizarre counterattacks with large forces where they apparently only know the blitz, right? They only know to come forward with tanks, armored personnel carriers, get them wiped out. Now they're devolved down to personal privately owned vehicles. We even saw references and photos of camels being used and donkeys being issued because they can't even maintain their Chinese little Chinese golf carts that are bringing troops out to the front. The war is just not the way they saw it being played out. Drones have changed the entire battlefield. They are now the equivalent of mortars, and they are precise. They are lethal, and for the most part, it will not allow Russia to carry out any offensive operations. But Ukraine has NATO's entire backing, its intelligence. A lot of this war, by the way, are played out on computers, where every factor is put into these massive analytical computers in Brussels and Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and they game the probability of carrying out various attacks and determining the weakest points, and then that's pushed forward into manpower who are actually carrying out those attacks. So Russia is at a great disadvantage here. They've just lost their 10,000th armored personnel carrier or tank that the Ukrainians have destroyed or damaged just this, I think, in the last 24 hours. So despite what Russia has the heft, it has the ability to maintain, how can you put it, glacier-like ability to defend, but there will be no breakthroughs. All this talk about, Russia breaking through and winning this war is pure fantasy.
And all the while, the impact on the Russian economy is enormous. And I think it's interesting talking about how increasingly Putin is relying on North Korea for help, both on the front line, but also now South Korean sources coming out and saying that North Koreans are being sent to fill construction jobs in Russia because they've got huge labor shortages.
Yeah, not only well, they have huge labor shortages for one glaring reason. Their manpower pool of educated men between the ages of 18 and 55 years old have been sent to Ukraine. And if Ukrainian statistics can be believed, and look, I believe them for the most part, Russia has taken and may exceed 1 million dead or wounded this year. I mean, that is a staggering number. But this isn't the Soviet Union. They don't have the birth rate. They don't have, large quantities of men that they can just order to go and die. There's no patriotic fervor for this war. It's being done essentially for oligarchy. The average Russian doesn't want to participate in it. And Russia is being impoverished of men from the war and also economically in this war. The sanctions do have bite to a certain extent. Then you have to look at how Ukraine has viewed this. Strategically, they decided they were going to ruin entire industrial bases of Russia, not just attack airfields, not just attack ammunition depots. They are out to destroy Russia as an oil producing nation in this world. And they have damaged as much as 40% of Russia's refining and production capability through the use of drones that Russian air defense do not seem to be able to stop at all. Ukraine has had much better success at stopping Russia's attacks than Russia has.
And on the assassination campaign that we've been seeing from Ukraine, I mean, I'm interested to get your thoughts as someone who worked in intelligence for many years, Malcolm. We had the killing of General Kirillov in Moscow in December. Another Russian warlord was killed in Moscow only last week. If you're Vladimir Putin, how concerned are you by this?
Well, I think for him, these are pinpricks. I mean, he has bigger problems in terms of, not being able to maintain, T-72 tanks or T-80 tanks and having to go back and get these old T-55s off of war memorials and try to maintain some ability for his forces to defend. I worked for Ukrainian Ministry of Defense Intelligence my first few months when I was there. They certainly did not need any intelligence, experience in dealing with the Russians in terms of human intelligence, infiltrating forces and resources into that country. These two nation states were locked together during the period of the Soviet Union. In fact, one Ukrainian army soldier that I fought with was a former Soviet Spetsnaz naval commando, then became a Ukrainian naval commando, and then became a Ukrainian army commando. He had been to all of the schools, all of the academies, knew Russian officers, had vacationed there, and could, if he wanted to, had walked through the battle line into Russia, linked up with people in GUR, which is Ukrainian Defense Intelligence, and carried out clandestine missions. Ukraine apparently has created networks, to be honest, that have gone almost all the way to Manchuria, where they have blown up train lines coming out of North Korea and China. They have set fire to rail terminuses. They put money on the table from GUR. And believe me, there are people in Russia who are willing to pick that money up and do something as simple as basic arson. With regards to the assassination of generals, that just shows a level of professionalism on the playing field, that they are not just carrying out operations or collecting intelligence or getting data waypoints for drones. They don't have to do that. We can do that by satellite now. They are carrying out an offensive capability to make the senior command in Russia afraid to come out of their house or to get into their car. And although these attacks may look like pinpricks, they are killing high-profile people who have very important jobs that could impact the war in such a way that, you kill a commander in charge of strategic rocket forces, for example, then, his junior colonel who has to take over be a little more reluctant to start bombarding, apartment blocks in Sumy or Kharkiv.
And I suppose it feeds into something that President Zelensky said many times, and he reiterated it last week. He was giving a speech marking 6 months since the Kursk incursion began, and he talked about, this is designed to bring the war home to Russia. What Putin used to call his special military operation probably felt very distant to a lot of Russians at the beginning. Do you think ordinary Russians are starting to notice the impact of the war more now?
Yes, I believe so. Principally, of course, in the West, in the western part of Russia, because Ukrainian drones are flying around with impunity. Even though Russian air defenses are pretty much, circular around the city of Moscow and other major cities out in the West, these drones are flying. You see videos every day of people going, look, there's another Ukrainian Beaver drone, which is just a small Cessna aircraft with a lot of explosives in it, flying autonomously with no air defense resistance. And the only place that they're getting that resistance is at key points that require defense. But when you have a massive drones, 100 drones or so a night, flying all over Russia, people are noticing that. They're hearing the explosions. They are seeing the videos of oil refineries blow up. Moscow's, Sheremetyevo airport being shut down, all ground, all traffic ground to a halt because drones have come from Ukraine, a country they were supposed to have destroyed in 72 hours. Well, apparently the war is not over. And it becomes one more point. It becomes even worse when you hear proclamations from the Kremlin saying that they want to now change the education curriculum of children between the ages of 8 and 15 to prepare them for a wartime life, which is, this is not going back to World War II and the Great Patriotic War, and so that you can get yourself on a statue in a small village. This is meat grinder war in which men and women now who are coming into the Russian armed forces disappear and are never returned to their homes. And the Russians aren't the Soviets, right? These aren't people who are having to fear Stalin. Vladimir Putin is very vulnerable on this point, and as the nation has economic hardship, I think that it's not going to be a question of revolution. It'll be a question of apathy, and men and women still trying to infiltrate their way out of Russia to some safe haven. And of course, that's going to decrease ability to carry out your own economy to produce items.
Well, I suppose that brings us on to Vladimir Putin's personal position, which, looking out, from outside, appears to be pretty strong currently. His grasp on power appears as strong as ever. But we saw, for example, during 2023 with Prigozhin and his attempted mutiny, how quickly things can change. How strong do you think Vladimir Putin really is, Malcolm?
I mean, he's as strong as an oligarch strongman can be. And his real strength lies in making sure that the people who have money, power, and influence in Moscow maintain that semblance of power, or making sure that they are very aware that they could walk out of a window at any time. And he has been excellent at that. He has had FSB officers or SVR officers assassinate oligarchs and billionaires outside of Russia, in Spain, and other places. When the helicopter pilot defected, that low-level helicopter pilot went to Spain, came up on the radar, was immediately killed. He can strike fear in some places. But if there were to be mass discontent, you can't arrest everybody. You can disappear young women, you can put people on trial, you can appeal to the elderly inside of Russia to have some sense of loyalty to the motherland. But for the most part, I'm not sure what it will take a greater expert than myself, maybe Mike McFall or John Cipher, someone who has operated in that country to understand at what point would revolution be on the table. And I thought, I'm not going to disclose any secrets here, but at one point, very early in the war, rebellion and internal strife was what we were looking to make the Russian forces do. There was a lot of friction between the Chechens and others. But the Ukrainians are far smarter than I could ever be. They know these people. And we at one point were talking about a campaign saying, all you have to do is turn around and go east, and don't forget to bring your guns, and have another 1917 revolution. But Prigozhin actually heard that. He apparently thought he could game this system, gain power in the South, and then cut this deal with Vladimir Putin. And no one knew Putin more than Prigozhin. This is the man who fed him when he ran the mafia criminal restaurant in St. Petersburg. And Prigozhin made him a made man by giving him defense feeding contracts, feeding every person in Russian schools. Prigozhin just went over his head and didn't realize that a murderous ex-KGB officer whose entire existence has been manipulating people and then disappearing them was not going to be in a position to negotiate. Prigozhin should have tried. He should have tried marching on Moscow, but then again, he learned the hard way what happens when you don't carry out your plans and make yourself the king in Russia.
There was something else that struck me from President Zelensky's comments last week. He talked about the offensive operations in Kursk being an example of how you achieve peace through strength. Mm-hmm. Do you think that is a notion that has been lost a bit on the side of Ukraine's allies in the West? Have we forgotten that?
Well, I agree with that, because we believe, or how can I put it, the conventional wisdom is that Ukraine is in a defensive war. Very early on, I think on Twitter, when I was still in the Army, and I had just spoken, I'd been taken off the line to speak by video to the economic summit in Davos. I had made a prediction that the Ukrainian army should just all out have gone for Volgograd and sliced the logistics and taken a Russian city. And at that time, that was seen as insane, right? But when Russia made its incursions down towards Sumy and into northern Ukraine for the second time, right? In 2023, it became very clear to NATO, US intelligence, and definitely to Ukrainian intelligence, who would put people in cars and drive them up to Kursk province, that there was nothing there to stop Ukraine from taking that territory if they wanted to. I, on the other hand, would have gone a little further. I would have turned west, some forces west, and threatened the Belarusian border from the east. Let them know that power politics with a competent armed forces, and the Ukrainian army, without all doubt, is the most competent armed force in the world at this point. They are just brilliant at what they do. They do take casualties because it's a meat grinder of a war, but they could have gone on to Kursk. This was a very strategic operation which had the goals of putting President Zelensky in a place where he could, should Russia weaken at any time, continue on further or crack their line in the south, should that, or threaten their logistics to the east. It gave him a multitude of directions he could create a threat to Vladimir Putin. I just don't believe Putin thinks it's real. I think he believes this is just some demonstration attack. It's not as severe as it could be, but he still had to beg North Korea for soldiers to go there. They were just decimated to the point of having to be drawn off the line. Even worse, South Korea is now interrogating them, right? They've brought South Korea into this war to a certain extent. I think Zelensky's operational plan for this, along with General Syrski, who I met in the pre-war, was quite smart in taking terrain that Russia would have to exchange. Who knows how long Russia can hold its defensive lines? We could wake up someday and find, far more terrain has been taken inside of Russia proper. But it remains to be seen how this will fit into Donald Trump's and General Kellogg's plans of trying to force some sort of end to the war.
Well, let's come on to that. I mean, I know that you've been very critical of President Trump in the past, both in relation to what he said about Ukraine, but also his domestic policies. But what have you made of his statements since returning to the White House about Russia and Ukraine? I mean, it was notable that he said, Putin's wrecking the Russian economy and he wants him to end the war and he wants him to come around the table. Have you been encouraged in any way by some of the rhetoric that's come out of the Trump administration in recent weeks?
Well, first off, when rhetoric comes out of the mouth of the Trump administration, you need to just discount that right off the top. Donald Trump is a pathological liar. Let's just stipulate some things that we all know, right? Most documented liar in American history. But policy is not necessarily the rhetoric that's coming out of Donald Trump's mouth. There's one thing that I thought was quite brilliant, and it wasn't carried out by an American. It was carried out by President Zelensky. When I first got to Ukraine, the rumors of how horrible corruption was in that country, you couldn't breathe. It was people had this impression it was like a white Nigeria, right? But when the war started, I saw none of that. That country flipped on a dime. People were hunting out their neighbors who were war profiteers. The government was rolling up anyone who was taking anything from the war effort. Ukrainians were dying by the thousands, and the country just wasn't going to have it. But what I saw with President Zelensky just recently, it's almost like he was using the lessons learned from the previous corrupt pro-Moscow governments in Ukraine to talk to Donald Trump. And that is understanding that Trump is a transactional leader. If there is not something in it for him, he will not do anything. And somehow he saw Moscow as a better partner because, of course, he has this bizarre relationship with Vladimir Putin mentally. But President Zelensky saw that Donald Trump would understand the promise of prospects of the United States having some favorable advantage or favorable opportunities of exploiting natural resources in eastern Ukraine should, of course, Russia be expelled from those areas. Rare earth minerals, major industrial minerals, the refurbishing of nuclear power plants. When you dangle money before Donald Trump's eyes, he's going to listen. I just thought this was just pure, brilliant statesmanship. He shifted from having to deal with what we have traditionally had since George Washington: honest, upright, non corrupt presidents of the United States who were under a constant eye, who you could not buy. And he dealt with them that way. He dealt with them in terms of loyalty, honor, appealing for the defense of democracy. With Donald Trump, he saw a person who was a convicted criminal who had to be spoken to like an oligarch. And I think he has Trump just right where he wants him. Because another component of this is his envoy, General Kellogg, has just returned from Ukraine and has dispelled this myth that Ukraine had $171 billion of money that was being stolen from U.S. coffers. That's a fantasy. It was $65.9 billion, and of that, $51 billion was being spent in the United States, in red states that voted for Trump, producing munitions for the U.S. Army that was getting rid of its old stock. Someone finally broke through to Donald Trump on that point. And so they were talking to him about money, and then Ukraine comes up and starts offering these potential future inducements should this war end on a favorable note for Ukraine. I think that is the only way to speak to this White House. Donald Trump having the fantasy that sometime before he moves on to the great beyond, that he'll get some cut out of the Ukrainian war. Sad, but true.
Well, just on that to finish, and this has been a fascinating conversation as ever, Malcolm, does that suggest that you actually are optimistic that this war can end in a way that is more favourable to Ukraine than many people seem to think? I mean, look, this war has seen horrendous losses on both sides. But if it ended in a way that Ukraine could say, you know what, we have actually dealt a significant blow to Vladimir Putin, it would be a fillip for the entire world. Do you actually think that is still possible?
Anything's possible, but I'm going to give you a hard reality check. I still maintain my contacts with my battalion. I fundraise for them. I bury my friends. We pay for all the burials. My friends are still on the line. I'm always tempted every day to go back and reenlist and help there. One thing I learned while I was in these destroyed villages in Kharkiv province on the zero line is that you cannot beat the Ukrainians for heart. They are not going to surrender Crimea. They are not going to surrender Zaporizhia, half of Kherson, allow Donetsk and Luhansk to remain in Russia's hands just so the shooting stops. These are people who have been brought up to blood. And Russia has done this to them. They have killed their women and children. They're killing their soldiers. Men and women in the Ukrainian armed forces die every day, and they are not going to accept any terms that appear surrender. This proposal that some have put forward as a peace plan to freeze the battlefront, right where it is along this line, create a demilitarized zone. No one's accepting that. No one. I certainly wouldn't. I've lost numerous friends in the International Legion who went there to help Ukraine defeat Russia, not come to a stalemate that surrenders to Russia. Very early on in the war, the one thing that you saw around Ukraine more than anything was a stencil of a Cossack's head. And for a long time, I didn't understand what the Ukrainian below it was until I started learning to speak Ukrainian. And it said, "We will not die as slaves." That phrase of being a slave is very, very powerful within their culture. These men in the Ukrainian army, these men and women, there are a lot of women in the army, these are Cossacks. You are not going to beat these people on the battlefield. They will throw rocks at you if they have to. But now, could something happen that forces Russia to withdraw to maybe closer to the 1991 lines? Who knows? The battlefront could break at any time. Ukraine could find themselves on the blitz. I'm a big believer that they have that capacity. They have enough combat throw weight. They have enough weapon systems from the West that Russia could just crack. Their line is a very fragile, tenuous, a fragile, tenuous position that is built on an offensive that will never succeed. It will never succeed. So I think that this war is going to continue. I don't think that there will be a peace treaty along the lines just for the sake of stopping the fighting, so Donald Trump can, fulfill some fantasy of being the new Teddy Roosevelt and Jimmy Carter, who really he has it in his head. I've heard from people who know him personally. The Nobel Peace Prize is the thing that he wants more than anything since Barack Obama got one. This war is not going to be fought so that his ego can be massaged at that level. I know we've spilled, when I say we, the royal we, as a former member of the Ukrainian army, too much blood has been spilled to surrender and to come up with a settlement that would look like they gave their country away. Not going to happen.
Malcolm, we always appreciate your insights and your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us again on Frontline.
It is my pleasure, really.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, James Hansen. For more on the war in Ukraine and other global conflicts, you can subscribe or sign up for a membership for exclusive videos. And you can also get the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or from thetimes.com.